By the time the tears settled into stillness, officers understood the shift was permanent, not temporary, and that noise itself had become dangerous inside those walls. The silence did not arrive peacefully. It followed shock, funerals, and fear, then hardened into policy, expectation, and habit, shaping daily life for everyone confined within. This was a reality at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, a federal prison that would become synonymous with control, quiet, and consequences few facilities attempted. What happened here changed how the federal system managed its most dangerous inmates, long before supermax became a familiar term, and long before public attention followed. But Marion's reputation was not built on architecture or isolation alone. It was forged in a brief, violent sequence that forced administrators to choose control over everything else. In October 1983, 2 correctional officers were killed inside the prison during separate incidents, an outcome that shattered assumptions about safety within maximum security federal institutions. The officers were Merle Klutz and Robert Hoff, and their deaths were not random acts but targeted attacks carried out by inmates already considered among the system's most dangerous. Those killings ended any remaining debate about whether traditional management could contain extreme violence, and they placed Marion at the center of an urgent federal reckoning. Within hours, administrators imposed an unprecedented response, a permanent, institution-wide lockdown that confined inmates to their cells for nearly all hours of the day daily. Movement stopped, programs vanished, and communication dropped to a minimum, creating an environment where even ordinary sounds carried risk, scrutiny, and consequences for everyone involved. The lockdown was not a temporary emergency measure. It became a defining condition of Marion, reshaping staff routines, inmate behavior, and the institution's purpose itself. Silence emerged as a tool, not a courtesy, enforced through discipline and expectation, reducing opportunities for coordination, intimidation, or spontaneous violence within confined spaces there. For inmates, the change was immediate and absolute, with meals delivered to cells, recreation eliminated, and human contact narrowed to brief, controlled interactions through steel barriers. For staff, the environment demanded constant vigilance, strict adherence to procedure, and emotional distance, as the margin for error had effectively disappeared overnight inside the prison. The men responsible for the killings, Clayton Fountain and Thomas Silverstein, were already serving long sentences, yet their actions exposed limits in existing control strategies. Silverstein, in particular, would later become emblematic of extreme isolation practices, though those developments grew from decisions first tested within Marion's lockdown units during this period. The lockdown did more than prevent movement. It recalibrated power inside the prison, shifting control decisively toward administrators through predictability, restriction, and constant observation there. Noise became suspicious. Gatherings became impossible, and influence was stripped from informal inmate hierarchies that thrived under earlier, more permissive management models inside Marion. This approach carried costs, including psychological strain and prolonged isolation, raising questions that would later surface in courts, policy debates, and federal oversight reviews nationwide. At the time, however, urgency outweighed nuance, as administrators prioritized preventing another fatal breach over considerations that seemed abstract compared to immediate, lethal risk inside. Marion became a proving ground, watched closely by federal officials searching for a model capable of containing inmates deemed uncontrollable by conventional standards at scale. Few outside the system understood how complete the transformation was, because the lockdown unfolded quietly, without the visibility or spectacle that often accompanies major policy shifts. There were no tours, no interviews, and limited reporting, leaving Marion's new reality largely hidden from public view, despite its significance for years afterward. Inside, days blended together under artificial routines, where predictability replaced autonomy and compliance became the primary currency for avoiding further restriction and punishment alike. This environment did not eliminate violence entirely, but altered its expression, suppressing overt acts while intensifying the system's reliance on isolation as prevention measure. As months turned into years, Marion's lockdown ceased being an exception and instead became a blueprint, influencing future facilities designed around similar philosophies' nationwide adoption. Administrators defended the approach as necessary, pointing to the absence of further officer killings as evidence that extreme control achieved its primary objective within Marion. Critics, meanwhile, argue the silence masked deeper harm, contending that long-term isolation created problems less visible but no less consequential for inmates and staff alike. Those debates would intensify later, but during Marion's early lockdown years, decisions were driven by memory of bloodshed rather than distant ethical forecasts and public scrutiny. What mattered most was that the prison had gone quiet, and that quiet signaled control regained after a moment when authority had violently failed there. Yet beneath that stillness lingered an unanswered question about sustainability, one that administrators could postpone but not permanently avoid as years accumulated inside Marion. The experiment at Marion was not designed as a study, but its outcomes would ripple outward, informing policies that reshaped federal incarceration for decades ahead. Supermax prisons did not emerge in a vacuum. They followed lessons learned in places like Marion, where silence became synonymous with security through enforced control. By the late 1980s, Marion's role had shifted from outlier to prototype, its legacy embedded in concrete, steel, and policy manuals across the system. The quiet that defined Marion was never merely about sound levels. It represented a philosophy that prioritized order above all competing values within federal prisons. That philosophy would soon be tested beyond Illinois, but its origins trace back to a moment when silence felt like the only acceptable answer there. The lockdown did not end debate. It intensified it, as Marion shifted from emergency response to long-term experiment in extreme control, forcing federal officials to confront consequences extending far beyond one institution. Administrators quietly acknowledged something significant. Marion's violence problem had not disappeared, but its visibility had transformed into tension managed through isolation rather than constant confrontation. This realization marked the first major shift, because the prison was no longer treated as broken, but as functional, even effective, under conditions once considered unacceptable. From that point forward, Marion became less a prison and more a reference point, shaping internal discussions about managing inmates labeled irredeemably dangerous within the federal system. Nowhere was this clearer than in the handling of Thomas Silverstein, whose role in the 1983 killing made him central to policy decisions rather than merely an individual offender. Silverstein was placed under increasingly restrictive conditions, kept alone, monitored constantly, and denied interaction that administrators believed could lead to further violence. These measures were not improvised. They were refined at Marion, setting precedents for how far isolation could be extended under administrative authority. What unsettled observers was not only the duration of confinement, but the lack of a clear endpoint, transforming punishment into something indefinite by design. Federal officials justified this approach by pointing to risk assessments, arguing that certain inmates posed permanent threats that conventional incarceration could not neutralize. This marked a philosophical turning point, because incarceration shifted from rehabilitation or deterrence toward pure incapacitation, with silence functioning as its primary mechanism. Legal challenges soon followed, questioning whether prolonged isolation violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment under evolving standards of decency. Courts initially deferred to prison administrators, citing safety concerns and extraordinary circumstances surrounding Marion's history of violence and officer deaths. Those rulings effectively validated the model, allowing the Bureau of Prisons to institutionalize practices first tested quietly within Marion's lockdown environment. With legal resistance limited, attention turned to expansion, as officials began planning facilities explicitly designed to replicate and intensify Marion's control-based regime. This planning phase revealed the deeper consequence of Marion's lockdown. It had normalized isolation as a routine management tool rather than an exceptional measure. The result was a conceptual leap toward purpose-built supermax prisons, facilities where silence, separation, and surveillance were not responsive to crisis but default conditions. Marion itself remained locked down, but its role shifted again, becoming a training reference and operational proof that extreme control could be sustained indefinitely. Few public officials openly discussed this evolution, because acknowledging it meant admitting that federal incarceration priorities had fundamentally changed without public debate. Inside the system, however, the implications were clear, especially to staff tasked with enforcing rules that reduce human contact to procedural necessity. Many officers reported reduced physical danger, but increased psychological strain, working in an environment defined by monotony, tension, and constant readiness. Inmates, meanwhile, experienced time differently, with days measured by meal slots and compliance checks rather than movement, conversation, or purposeful activity. Mental health professionals raise concerns about sensory deprivation, anxiety, and cognitive decline associated with long-term isolation, particularly when imposed without clear timelines. Those warnings entered internal reports, but rarely altered policy, because Marion's primary metric remained officer safety rather than inmate psychological outcomes. The absence of further officer deaths reinforced administrative confidence, even as questions about long-term damage quietly accumulated within the system. By the early 1990s, the Bureau of Prisons openly acknowledged the need for a new facility to house inmates like Silverstein under even stricter conditions. That acknowledgement was the clearest admission, yet that Marion's model, while effective, was not considered sufficient for the most extreme cases. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe, because the next one goes even deeper. The facility envisioned would eliminate remaining variables, reducing human interaction to the absolute minimum, while maximizing physical and procedural control. This plan did not emerge suddenly. It was a logical extension of lessons learned through Marion's prolonged lockdown and its perceived successes. Construction decisions, design philosophies, and operational rules all reflected conclusions drawn from Marion's decades-long experiment with enforced silence. When administrators spoke internally about risk elimination, Marion was cited repeatedly as evidence that extreme isolation could be justified and maintained. What remained unresolved was whether such environments solved violence or merely displaced it into less visible, more internalized forms of harm. Marion continued operating under its restrictive regime, even as attention shifted elsewhere, leaving behind a legacy embedded in policy rather than public memory. The prison had proven something unsettling: that silence would be engineered, enforced, and defended, even when its human costs remained uncertain. As the federal system prepared to move further down this path, Marion stood as both warning and blueprint, its quiet echoing far beyond Illinois walls. The question was no longer whether silence worked, but how far the system was willing to take it. By the time ADX Florence opened in the mid-1990s, Marion's influence was complete, having shaped a new category of incarceration defined by isolation, silence, and absolute administrative control. The Bureau of Prisons did not describe this shift as ideological, but operational, framing supermax confinement as a technical solution to individuals deemed impossible to manage elsewhere. Yet Marion never closed during this transition. It remained active, continuing its long lockdown while serving as historical justification for newer, more extreme facilities. Over time, Marion's role quietly diminished, not because its model failed, but because it had been surpassed by institutions designed to institutionalize its harshest lessons. ADX Florence would eventually house inmates like Thomas Silverstein, transferring Marion's most extreme cases into an environment built specifically for permanent isolation. This transfer did not mark reform. It marked escalation, moving practices once improvised into permanent architectural features reinforced by policy and law. Marion, meanwhile, retained its identity as the prison where the system learned silence could be enforced indefinitely without immediate collapse. For decades, inmates remained locked in their cells for 23 hours a day, a condition that became normalized through repetition rather than resolution. The prison soundscape reflected this reality, where quiet corridors replaced communal noise, and the absence of voices became an indicator of order achieved. Silence was not absolute, but was regulated, with every sound interpreted to the lens of control, compliance, or potential threat. Former inmates later described environments where speaking loudly attracted discipline, reinforcing self-censorship as a survival mechanism rather than an imposed rule. This behavioral conditioning extended beyond policy, embedding silence into daily habit until restraint became instinctive rather than enforced. Correctional officers adapted similarly, relying on routine and distance, interacting through procedures that minimized unpredictability and personal engagement. Over time, Marion became less visible in national discourse, overshadowed by newer supermax facilities that captured public attention. Yet its significance persisted quietly within internal training, legal arguments, and policy frameworks shaping federal incarceration. Marion's prolonged lockdown also attracted scrutiny from human rights organizations who questioned whether indefinite isolation violated evolving international norms. Reports highlighted psychological deterioration, depression, and anxiety linked to prolonged sensory deprivation, particularly when inmates lacked meaningful human interaction. Federal officials acknowledged these concerns but maintained that security imperatives outweighed potential harm, citing Marion's violent past as justification. This rationale revealed a central tension: whether preventing rare but catastrophic violence justified continuous, systemic deprivation across entire populations. Courts largely deferred to administrators, reinforcing a precedent where security claims carried decisive legal weight. As a result, Marion's model endured, insulated from meaningful reform by its perceived effectiveness rather than its long-term consequences. In 2006, the Bureau of Prisons officially ended Marion's permanent lockdown, restoring limited movement for some inmates after more than 2 decades. This change did not represent reversal, but closure, as Marion's role as experimental prototype had already fulfilled its institutional purpose. Even with modified operations, the prison's legacy remained embedded in federal correctional philosophy. Supermax confinement continued elsewhere, informed by Marion's lessons rather than constrained by its outcomes. The silence that once defined Marion had already migrated, replicated within newer walls designed to make such conditions permanent and unquestioned. For staff and inmates who lived through Marion's lockdown, the experience left lasting impressions, shaping perceptions of authority, compliance, and human limits. Many describe environments where time felt suspended, where days blurred, and where the absence of sound mirrored the absence of autonomy. Marion demonstrated that control could be achieved not through constant force, but through removal, isolation, and predictability enforced over time. That realization altered how power operated within prisons, shifting the emphasis from reactive discipline to preemptive deprivation. While public attention focused elsewhere, Marion remained a quiet cornerstone of modern incarceration policy. Its story is not defined by architecture or geography, but by decisions made under pressure that became normalized through repetition. What began as emergency response evolved into doctrine, leaving behind a model rarely questioned once institutionalized. Marion showed that silence could be sustained, defended, and expanded, even as its costs accumulated slowly and invisibly. The prison's influence persists not because it still operates at maximum restriction, but because it proved something the system never forgot. It proved that when fear governs policy, silence becomes both solution and justification. And once silence is accepted, reversing it becomes far harder than imposing it. If this story kept you watching, the next one will stay with you even longer. Subscribe for more real prison documentaries.